as the lead figure in trade unions against the EU, which is one of the few bodies in the country that has significant trade union support. I think RMT, the bakers, ASLEV. And clearly Doug is, very well versed in many of the issues that have been raised earlier on, and he will address some of those. Doug.
Thanks very much indeed, Graham. When speaking on the EU in Birmingham, I can't help but remember our late comrade Ron Dorman, with whom we did so much campaigning over the years. There are other friends in the room who've made a major contribution to the recognition that we've got to get out of the EU. I'm thinking my lifelong friend and comrade Manuel, who's here, and I remember very distinctly a major contribution he made in Unison. Now, Manuel's from Latin America, and you'll know their custom is to have very expansive discussions and make very long speeches. And the opportunity that Manuel had to speak against the EU in Unison at their conference was a 3-minute speech. So it took Manuel, I recall, in the 80s, about a week to hone his speech down against the Maastricht Treaty, from one of the Castro 6-hour speeches to the 3 minutes. And he made that devastating speech, which was the biggest public sector union at the time, still is. And that was a very major contribution to the work that we've done over the years in the trade union movement to get this issue as straight as we possibly can. I think I've been secretary of all the trade union-based campaigns against Maastricht, against the single currency, against the constitution, and then eventually against the EU. I'm concentrated on having the debates within the official movement. I thought in June 2016 might be able to have a rest after 40 years or so campaigning on this issue, but we've had to do more since then, because they don't like it up 'em, do they? And they've done everything they possibly can to try and say that we were foolish and to upset the vote. And of course that's their tradition and that's their function. It struck me that if Kim and Ken and Arthur and Costas and myself were the negotiating team for Britain, no bull, we'd be out by now, wouldn't we? If the working class view and people with some experience of negotiation had been in the frame, the simplicity of leaving the European Union on behalf of the biggest ever mandate that any politicians have received in British history would have actually been quite a straightforward thing to do. Out of the European Union means out of the single market. The single market is based on the false neoliberal freedoms, really restrictions, the freedom of movement of capital being one of the most fundamental. And of course it was Thatcher in October 79 who made that momentous, historic decision, probably the most historic she made, to remove exchange controls on capital in Britain. And we saw consequently all the wealth that we created, particularly out of the manufacturing base, fly elsewhere. And that of course was the whole basis of the single market in the EU. The freedom of capital to globalise and go where it could, creating misery in its wake. The other freedom, of course, the freedom of movement of people and labour. Much has been said about this. Let me add my 2 penneth. Many of us in this room will remember the time when Norman Tebbit said, "Get on your bike," in face of mass unemployment. And there was horror everywhere in our culture that someone would have said, you've got to move from Coventry to Birmingham, cycle down the road for a job, because there was a fundamental right, we thought, to be able to live and work happily and contentedly and in some comfort wherever you lived. We then get the freedom of movement of labour throughout the European Union, which has had disastrous consequences. One side of it that we say little enough about has been the way in which it hollows out the workforce of the countries who've been forced to send so many people overseas. Look at the skills gaps now in those accession nations that came in, and there's a flood of labour out of their own countries into everywhere else. People becoming nomads because capital was flying, they were forced to follow in its wake, and that has caused a huge crisis and misery for so many. And we know the freedom of goods and services and all the rest of it. We know the consequences of that in the global market that others have spelt out. Now, there's a frenzy on at the moment because the clarity that we would have brought to the table if we were negotiating out of the single market, out of a customs union, because a customs union confines you to an area of the world. Whatever that customs union is, it automatically means that you can't trade as freely as you would need to rebuild your own economy. Out of the common fisheries policies, which has devastated our fishing industry and taken control over our own waters, and out of the common agricultural policy, with all of the disaster that has brought to our country for so long, and what it's done to completely reverse our ability to be self-sufficient and self-reliant in food. And of course, it means being out of the EU means stopping those payments. We've been one of the 4 net contributors to the EU, and all, in fact, of the projects that you see around the country now saying funded by the EU is a little bit of our own money back. And by the way, let's never forget that the EU accounts failed to be audited, and have failed to be audited for about 20 years now, I think it is, because it is rife with corruption and they don't know where it all goes. So that's what out would mean if we were in charge. Simple enough. And I've always found it a bit perplexing that now there's discussions about tests and the deal and all the rest of it, and having to have votes on the deal that they come up with, because out should mean out, straightforwardly. But if they want some tests on any deal that comes back to Parliament, they're all fairly self-evident, they're all obvious. Does any deal that is reached on leaving, if that's what has to happen, mean that we can again be self-reliant as an economy and have the flexibility that we need to rebuild the skills and the manufacturing base, which, as Costas has said, are the driver for any revitalised politics and economics here? Would we still be controlled by the procurement and competition policies of the single market, which have meant that British manufacturers have been disadvantaged consistently alongside the multinationals in Europe for work in Britain? Would we still be subject to that? If we were, we would still be in the EU. Does leaving, another test we'd have to apply, does leaving the deal mean leaving the EU would enable us to arrange our own trading agreements with other countries? Would it allow us to have laws and regulations determined by ourselves rather than others? Would a leaving deal ensure that we could rebuild all parts of our country equally? Would it create a fair and effective labour market? Would it mean that employment rights that we fought for consistently over the generations would be protected and extended? And would we have to make such ginormous payments into the EU and any leaving arrangements, and so on? These would be the simple, straightforward, working-class tests that we would apply to any deal that comes back. And we would reject Starmer's tests, which are false traps designed to try and keep us in. Basically saying that does the deal arrangements still have the equivalence of the single market and our membership, and so on. We could do it simply, we could get out neatly and cleanly. Now there's part of me that thinks that we should be as realistic as we always are, not necessarily optimistic or pessimistic. We should be realistic. And I still think that with all the bluff and the bluster and the brinkmanship and the press going bananas, as they always will do about these kind of parliamentary machinations and the negotiations that are taking place, with all that, We, I think, are going to be out on March the 29th, and in fact I've arranged a hotel to have a party with some veteran campaigners, and I would hope a few people are getting some street parties ready for that day. I think it is going to happen, despite all the fluff at the moment, because there is a widespread recognition that we have a very significant vote behind us that will be difficult to upset. And that vote has, I believe, from all our travels across Europe recently from our organisation, genuinely lit a spark in Europe. Costas has indicated what's happening in Italy. In France, Mélenchon is saying he wants to tear up all the EU treaties, and there is a gathering head of steam amongst socialists in France and in Germany, from what I can see, to say that what we've done here should inspire others. We've been to Sweden recently, the same. We've been to Poland, the same. Like many of the accession countries, Poland, as a condition of joining the EU, had to tear up all of their national collective bargaining with the unions. That was a condition of joining. So from a position of 97% collective bargaining coverage in Poland, down now to less than 20% because of the EU. And so it goes on. And workers, as Costas has indicated, across the continent are getting inspired by what we've done to reassert self-determination. So there's a waking up at this moment of history. It's happened many times before in our history, and if you look deep into our culture, our songs and our poetry, there's that great myth of the sleeping giant. There are periods of moving forward as an organised peasantry or oppressed peoples or working class, and then there are defeats and you're set back. It's always been like that in the ebb and flow of struggle of our history in Britain, of struggle against the ruling class. There have been movements forwards, periods of defeat, sleeping and consolidation, and then a reawakening of the giant. And that's what's happening now in the vote of the 17.4 million, a working class, progressive, positive vote. It has taken us forward in all sorts of ways. The ruling class, unsurprisingly, have always been divided on this issue. Very crudely and briefly, finance capital and the multinational corporations section of the ruling class have always favoured the EU. Those domestic, smaller capitalists, along with other nationalists on their side, have been opposed to it. And we shouldn't be shy of the fact that they are divided in that way, and there is a contradiction between them. Now, the reaction to what we've done has been pretty intense, and it's kind of shining down rather strangely on the question of Ireland. So maybe a couple of things about that. Jose Manuel Barroso was mentioned. He used to be the president of the EU. He now works for Goldman Sachs. And that is a revolving door that's been there probably since the 30s, certainly since the 40s, between big finance houses in Wall Street and various key players in the federal European Union agenda. Because let's not forget that amongst the very nasty international forces that wanted a federal Europe to put paid to the democracy of independent nations, Wall Street has always been a big player. Now, I mentioned Barroso because he did and does refer to the EU as an empire. And of course that federal agenda to create that empire was evident from the late 60s, and Heath and everyone lied to us, as all the papers now reveal, about going in. Their plans always were to take away the sovereign powers of independent nations and to create the superstates led by the market. So internally, the big powers, as Costas has said, notably Germany, colonise and asset strip the smaller powers like Greece and many others. And they force migrations internally. Externally, they force starvation on Africa through their agricultural policies, and they continually support that drive of Germany to the east. Now, many of us here might have remembered the time when, in the 70s and 80s, we were starting to look at the collapse of steel and coal, the deliberate, systematic attacks on the most fundamental parts of our industry and energy. So let's not forget on a day like this in the manufacturing heartlands of our country that the whole shebang started with the European coal and steel community, which sought to run down steel and coal in those countries who were productive in it in order to materially take away the ability to have political independence. If you can't provide your own energy, your own steel, you've got problems politically, you become dependent. Now, the empire has put into itself things like Article 50, which try and make any leaving of the club as difficult as possible. So they've done that, and that partly explains why there are difficulties in these negotiations now. But, as Costas and others have said, we've got to remember that that is an act of desperation on their part. Their history of defeating referendums on the basis now of their weakened economy and the declining Eurozone mean that they are taking desperate acts. And in one of the savage ironies of history, one of those acts is to use the question of Ireland in a way that is distorting, shall we say, at the very least, the clarity that should be there in the negotiations. They'll make any sacrifice, or they'll try and create any sacrifice, any difficulty on these islands to have their way. And what an irony in a country now of Ireland where the south wants to be run by Brussels and the northern counties want to be run by Westminster, and now the EU, if you think about it, is trying to run the whole place. So the Northern Ireland border actually has got more checkpoints already, about 208, than checkpoints throughout the whole of Europe. And the flow of trade across it is largely agricultural. A relatively small amount of Northern Ireland's total trade is with the Republic, and it was worth in the region of 4 billion in 2016. And also about 1% of the Republic's trade is with Northern Ireland, and about 11% of their trade with Britain. The Republic of Ireland is the 5th biggest customer for UK exports. The UK is the 2nd biggest customer for Irish exports. So we obviously need frictionless trade between our two countries, and we don't need any external power to use the difficulties there to say that there must be a hard border, which is what, in effect, the EU is trying to force onto the situation. Now, all the HMRC people, all the experts in custom and excise, and all the technocrats know that there are simple, straightforward, practical solutions to that once the politics is properly sorted. So that's not something that we're going to allow to be used against our leaving the EU. We want frictionless trade with Ireland and the two countries working together in new, creative cooperation in ways that they've not done before. Now that perhaps takes us back to the most important element of this whole debate, and that is the question of self-determination. And for many of us, if we consider where those concepts of national self-determination come from, we've been inspired over the years by some of the great leaders that have come from Ireland, who have talked about the importance of their country being independent, and our country too. So who was it who said, what is a free nation? A free nation is one which possesses absolute control over all of its own internal resources and powers, and which has no restriction upon its intercourse with other nations similarly circumstanced, except the restrictions placed upon it by nature. A free nation must have complete control over its own harbours, to open them or close them at will, or shut out any commodity, or allow it to enter in, just as it seems best to suit the well-being of its own people and in obedience to their wishes, and entirely free of the interference of any other nation, and in complete disregard of the wishes of any other nation. Short of that power, no nation possesses the first essentials of freedom. It's James Connolly, of course, and those principles from 1916 still hold more importantly today than ever, because to get out of this globalized neoliberal world, we need again to reassert with bravery and courage the importance of national self-determination, which people in other countries over the years have, of course, had to assert and achieve through the loss of life and the shedding of blood. We've had it relatively easy. The EU staged a by and large peaceful, slow-motion coup d'etat against our country and the other countries in the European continent. And we, by and large, have had a peaceful national liberation struggle for 40 years to get out of it. We are now coming to the final stages of getting out and being able to celebrate ourselves that empowering sense of liberation and freedom which they felt in Vietnam in 1975, which they still feel in Cuba today and many other parts of the world, where workers have said that the absolute fundamental right to self-determination is a prerequisite of our socialism and our independence. Back to Connolly to conclude. Under a socialist system, every nation will be the supreme arbiter of its own destinies, national and international, will be forced into no alliance against its will, but will have its independence guaranteed and its freedom respected by the enlightened self-interest of the socialist democracy of the world. We're on a new journey, comrades, a journey together, independent, to rebuild Britain. Thanks.
Thanks very much.